All right, so Professor Gilmore said he was going to project tonight and not use a mic, and I learned this once upon a time, so I'm also going to project and do my best to make sure everybody can hear me. I'm only going to be up here for a few minutes, and I'll try not to get kind of emotional in a way, because this is the second year of the Empowerment Institute, but we were trying to fill a room like this all of last year, and for whatever it's worth, whatever we're going through in history, maybe it's the second year, this is something that fills me with great joy. And so I'll just go into my few minutes. I'm Dylan Savory. I'm the executive director of the Union Labor Federation that covers Fresno, Madera, Tulare, and Kings counties. And thank you. It's always cool to get a few claps, but the bottom line is we are not a top-down movement. And my position is, I'm a steward of this movement. Really, the power resides with folks like you, activists, union members, people that are doing good in their communities. So the reality is you all deserve the applause a lot more than I. So maybe we can give each other a round of applause and it'll make more sense. So the Empowerment Institute is a brainchild we came up with a year and a half ago to activate more everyday neighbors that might be active in their communities, but they want to be either even more active and they don't know how, or students that are just getting into, adult life, or folks that might be active on national issues but are not paying attention to local issues. And we don't think people meet in person enough. COVID, the internet, all of these different things have caused us to lose touch with each other, and we think that is the perfect opportunity to create an intersection for workers' rights, policy discussion, and activism, because the bottom line is the largest demographic in this country and probably in the world are workers. The grand majority of people are workers, and that doesn't, no disrespect to business owners, right? But we're the largest demographic, and for the most part, we are not getting the wealth or comfort or any of the other things that the middle class deserves, like maybe some of our distant relatives did at some other great time in this country that people pretend that we're going back to. Here's our policy statement in a nutshell, or the idea. Our work as a labor movement is about helping workers and representing folks, but our workers are mostly struggling in every single community. This is true because they're overwhelmed by the lack of time, social connections, and education about local issues to make meaningful improvement in their lives, much less care about the lives of their neighbors. Really, as a community, we should be caring about each other. We should be lifting each other up. But the internet has all kinds of stuff. It's hard to find the truth. You can't just go online and type in truth, right? There's all of these different distractions in our lives. And because we're overwhelmed either by getting work too hard or we're stressed out from our working conditions or our family lives, it's very difficult to make connections and be in community and even think about how we're going to make a difference in our schools or our work lives or the streets in our neighborhoods. And sometimes we're very focused on national issues, which are important, or international issues. We're really focused on Palestine, Ukraine, things happening internationally. We're really stressed out, but we could really use some attention on our local stuff. So workers are overwhelmed. And the concept here is we want to break that cycle because finding truth and curriculum and community is difficult. So we want to create a free curriculum, and that's what we have. We have the whole year planned out, and I'll tell you about the first couple events that we have for the year at the end of this. A free curriculum for anybody who desires to become more active in their communities. Monthly workshops for any type of activist that you want to be. If you've never been an activist and you want to become active, great. If you want to be more active online, great. If you want to hold a stop sign at your kid's crosswalk at school, great. If you want to run for office, great. We have something for you. Not every workshop may be designed for every level of activism, but we're going to offer one every month. You can come to them. They'll be free. There'll be food every time. You can bring your kids. And if we get people that indicate that they need translation, we're going to do our best to accommodate that as well. So we're trying to offer our expertise that we have built to create more activism in the community. And we know that local and regional experts are seeking to build a pipeline of active neighbors to, and students to become, we need more consistent voters, we need more community leaders, we certainly need more organizers, and we need better government officials, whether you're working in government or you're running for office. So every level of activism is needed, And the reality is we cannot make progress in our community. We cannot make progress if we are not in community. So we want to incorporate action, these type of events here where you learn something that you want to take into action, but we're also going to do social events every month. So we did the Martin Luther King March just a few weekends ago. And next month we're doing a Union Super Bowl party. And in March, we're going to do a community cleanup together because volunteering to make our communities better is very important and it feels good. We think successful communities are active communities. You know, I'm not a philosopher, but I know what may work if we're together and we're working together and we're doing things for our neighbors more often. So here's the goal. If we can increase regional activism by 1%, we'll have 17,000 people that are ready to come to city council meetings or lift up people that are running for good offices or clean up our neighborhoods or give food out to needy families during Thanksgiving, all things that we plan on doing this year. So there's workshops, social events. 1%. Can we do that over the next 3 or 4 years? That's what we're going to aim to do. This year is different from last year because we've honed our agenda a little bit. So we have 3 different distinct areas of our teachings. You're here tonight as a part of the landscape series. So some people might be more interested in knowing what kind of community or movement am I looking to understand more. So we have working class history this month. Civil rights, both current and past, next month, same room. We're going to do one on propaganda and disinformation every year. Very important. That'll be at the end of the year. And we have power mapping that we're going to do in every December. Whether there was an election in November or an election coming up, we're going to teach you how to power map communities so you understand how policy works. Then coming up, we're going to do a governance workshop called Govern, teaching people, citizens, how to interact with local governments, public comment letters, testimony, how do you get across to your local elected officials. This is in the policy series. Project labor agreements and community benefits agreements. Those are a little more in the weeds, but you should definitely know about them. Great legal outcomes for communities and labor organizations. And then we're going to do regional planning, land use, and climate initiatives. Every year, these will be dynamic. We're going to teach these every year with similar speakers, but the topics will slightly change. We're going to teach people then how to run for office with Represent. Right after that, how to run campaigns, very different. How to form a union, which I'm really excited about, and how to become an organizer as a part of our Organize series. So if any of these interest you or all of them, you're welcome at all of these things. We'd encourage you to bring your neighbors, your kids, anybody else that would be interested. Click. Okay, I'm almost done. These are the upcoming workshops that I mentioned. Vaughn probably gave you a couple flyers on the way in, and if you made it here tonight, you're on our mailing list. So you're going to get this stuff regularly. And shout out to Vaughn, who did all the amazing graphics and artwork for all this. He's checking people in. Big thanks to Brenda as well. So, powerwithpeople.org, we have all of our stuff on there. It's just the events, but MLK March, then working class history this month. Union Super Bowl party, civil rights next month, community cleanup, project labor agreements in March. And as soon as we end tonight, we'll be working on updating this with our April events so you can digest 6 events at a time, plan your quarter, and make sure you join us for all of our stuff. So if you need anything else, you feel free to scan this. I think you're all in the database, but I'm done talking. I want you all to be the stars of this show, and I really am looking forward to hearing our special guest tonight. And just a kind of a quick, funny thing about Professor Gilmore, we met to talk about working class history and how we can execute this event tonight. And he had 5 different angles from 5 different points in history, all relevant to what's happening in today's, whatever we're calling this presidency right now. And that means that every year we can do working class history in January. Every year Paul can come back, and every year you can get a different angle on why we should be doing things, learning from the past, and activating ourselves in the present. So we're going to do this every year. It'll be different. And without me chatting anymore, I just want to give it up to Professor Paul Gilmore. Sir, thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here. This is great. I wasn't expecting such a nice big crowd, so I really appreciate it. Yeah, all right. I was playing some music as we as we were having dinner and everything, but it kept on going back to ads about paying taxes, which I thought maybe was fitting, right? You know, I mean, my goodness. I shouldn't even mention the ad, though, right? That's the rule. If you mention the ad, they won. Now, you got to not mention the ad. Never mention the ad. All right. Yeah, I played a couple songs there. Okay, so here's I think what I want to do is do a kind of thing where we'll talk a little bit about the history, but I also want to talk about just the idea of class for a little bit, and not to get all, you know, philosophical about it or get into, you know, Marx's second volume of Das Kapital or something like that, but rather just to talk about it a bit in America, talk about wealth a little bit, and then talk about what, well, I'm hoping is becoming less true, but a kind of studied amnesia that people have about the labor history. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that historians or history, you know, talking heads veto important lessons from history. There's all kinds of ways, there's all kinds of topics that are vetoed from our history. And labor history was, frankly, the first one I found out about when I was, you know, like a junior in high school. You know, one of those scratching my head moments and saying, wait a minute, that seems important. And yet, you know, it gets glossed right over. Or it was one of those, I guess you could say it in a different way, it was one that sometimes I think elementary school, when you're a little kid, you've got this, you don't have very much knowledge about anything, but you still do have, you know, pardon the terminology, you still do have the bullshit detector when you're in first grade, you know? And maybe your parents tried to get rid of it, but they couldn't do it. But then first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade, as they tell you what to think about history especially, you begin to lose the ability to ask basic questions. Oh, that doesn't seem right? That kind of thing. That bullshit detector. And so, in a way, I think kind of unvetoing stuff from history helps you cultivate your bullshit detector, I guess, a little bit. I won't go too much into what I'm going to do. I'll just do it. But I want to talk about the history of the working class in America for a bit. And I guess one more thing about me before we really get started. I went to a college in Greenville, South Carolina. Greenville, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but I went to a college called Furman. They were playing basketball on the TV the other day. Furman University, a little tiny liberal arts college in the 1980s, back in the 20th century. Then I went to Milwaukee. I'm from Wisconsin, so I go to Milwaukee. Did I say Milwaukee? I apologize. I went to Milwaukee, and in Milwaukee, I studied labor history, and my advisor introduced me to something. You know, I was all into labor history, and my advisor said, well, you know, there's not just steel workers and coal miners and auto workers in the world. You know, I mean, it was that kind of thing, and I already kind of had grasped that. But I studied grocery store workers, believe it or not. I spent most of I guess, probably 5 years of my life studying grocery store workers, that is, retail clerks and butchers. And if you ever want to learn, just as a little plug here, I did go down to Georgia Tech and did a PhD on that. Didn't finish it. I got 280 pages in, and then I got this gig and said, to hell with it, I'm going to teach. But anyway, if you ever want to find anything out about grocery store workers or supermarkets at all between 1925 and 1955 in Chicago and LA, I'm the guy. I'm the one who knows everything about that. Just that, though. I won't mention any of that here today. Grocery store workers are out. I thought about bringing them in, but no grocery store workers. Yeah, we're talking millions, right? Millions of people. But one thing, I guess maybe one thing I will say before I really get moving here, one thing I will say about grocery store workers. My goodness, I came out here for the first time as an adult in 1998, and I went to San Francisco, and for the first time since I was an adult, I saw we're talking 30-year-old men and women checking groceries. 30, 40, 50-year-old men and women checking groceries in San Francisco. Why? Union contract. A decent job. A decent job that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people had, but was crushed. That industry was crushed in the 1980s as part of I guess what you would call concessionary bargaining of the Reagan years. Reagan's firing of the Patco workers was not a shot across the bow, it was a direct hit. And everybody just went into turtle mode, and my Milwaukee workers were destroyed, right? So one of the points I'm going to make in here is about how labor history shows that this struggle for power is constantly going on. It's constantly going on, and sometimes there are victories, and then sometimes there are just crushing defeats. And then you have to rebuild. But I'm going to try to focus on, well, this is a labor history talk. Mostly we're going to focus on people losing. But I am going to talk about some victories and try to suggest how to maybe our story can help us give us a background about how it was done before and maybe then how to do it again. But let me start here, because I want to get into that story in a roundabout way and talk to you about why we should even care. Now, I know you all care. You're here. This is the Empowerment Institute and so on. But let me start with a general question here, and that is, what is class anyway? How do we typically talk about class? What's the language we use when we talk about class? Anybody? Yeah. Lower, middle, upper, and then we divide them up, don't we? We go, well, I'm actually upper middle class, and I'm lower middle class, or I'm middle. Nobody says middle. Have you noticed that? And then lower class. I'm lower class. What would you say if we were supposed to have some kind of, some kind of survey of Americans? How do you think most Americans would place themselves, upper, middle, or lower? Anybody have it? Middle, right? And I've done this with my students. It's really quite amazing. I used to do this with my students where I would say, all right, are you all middle class? Or I wouldn't say that. I would say, what are you, lower, middle, or upper? And everybody'd say they're middle class. I don't know if you know much about the demographics of the students at Fresno City College or the demographics of the people in this zip code, but lots of people would not see those students of mine, some students in here, as middle class, right? They would put them at lower. So I always ask the question, where does lower class begin? And everybody starts talking money, right? Where does it begin? Let me ask, does anybody have a notion of where you think it should begin? If you make below a certain amount, you're lower class. Anybody want to throw out a number?
No, well, the working class classified at Yale, right?
Okay, so let's say 21,000, that's poverty level, right? For a family of 3 or something like that. So 21,000. I think a lot of people would think that even if you make more than that with a family of that size, you're probably still considered not quite middle class, right? But if you're in a neighborhood where every single person is in exactly that position, that's your world. And you're going to go, well, this is a middle class country. We're all in the same position. I'm middle class, right? I mean, there's a bit of that goes on. Yeah.
There is no such
Yeah, that's what a lot of people have been saying. No more middle class, and this is going to be hollowed out, and that's going to be kind of a little piece of the story that I'm going to tell here. Yeah, this middle class seems to be disappearing. People are desperate and on the edge. Yeah. Anybody else have yeah.
I would think of middle class as being somebody who has a dependable job that they can, stay at for a long time.
Something beyond money. The idea of maybe a professional job is a middle class job. By the way, sociologists used to really ask just that question. Where are you, lower, middle, or upper? And most people would put themselves in middle class. But then when you actually ask people, about 80% would put themselves in the middle class. But then when you ask people and give them the opportunity to say what you said, this word that in the 20th century was not allowed, if you say working class, all of a sudden half those middle class people put themselves as working class. They just didn't want to say lower class maybe, but they put themselves in working class. They're not middle class, they're working class. And in a way, for decades there then, we had a veto of working class talk at all because it just wasn't among the boxes to tick, right? Now this idea of lower, middle, and upper class, I always get a kick out of it because I saw an interview of Trent Lott 25 years ago. I was just telling somebody before the thing started here. Saw an interview of Trent Lott about 25 years ago. Trent Lott was the Senate, the leader of the Senate of the Republicans, and kind of had to resign. And well, we won't get into that. But he said, well, what you're talking about is harming the middle class. And somebody asked him, well, where does the middle class start? What's the number there? And you said, well, 21,000. Trent Lott said the lower class starts at about $125,000 a year. If you make less than that, you're low class, right? He didn't, and I don't think he even realized that he was talking at the time about the top 3% of the people in this country, right? 97% are lower class. Didn't know, right? So we have this weird way of talking about it, I think. And then it always makes me ask, well, what class are you in, right? And I'm sure we've got a lot of people in here who identify as working class or middle class or upper middle class. But you probably don't just think in terms of money, right? You were talking about job and status and so on. And I always ask my students, well, what class am I then? And I call myself 19th century middle class, right? Because I'm the son of two 19th century middle class, preacher, teacher, right? Preacher, teacher, and then professor, right? So preacher, teacher, professor, we're middle class. And I always tell that to my students, and then I tell them, and I'll tell you now, I hope you know this, but some of you might not know this, but the people who teach our classes, fully half of them, SCFT 1533 has done pretty well by its full-time professors, but half of them are part-time. And only in the last few years have we even given lip service to doing right by them. And so I always tell my students, if it wasn't me in front of you, you'd be talking to a middle-class professor who makes a maximum, up until just a few years ago, a professor at this school teaching the classes that I teach, they can make a maximum of $29,000 a year, teaching as many courses as I teach. That is, they would teach in the summer to make up for those courses that they can't teach in the fall and spring. So they teach the whole year round and make basically $30,000 a year. They get fired every term. They had no health care, no pension, and that was only after you'd worked there for 10 years and had a PhD, right? No health care, none of that. I said, is that person middle class? Well, we like to pretend. Well, anyway, what class am I in? I'm a middle class guy, I guess. But this question of how that's determined is, I think, important. Working class is thankfully, how many of you have heard that term a lot, working class, in the last few years? Yeah, me too. Part of my problem with the way we talk about working class in our political discourse is that it's always some sort of reactionary political group, right? And we call them the working class, which I think is just an awful way of framing it. Most of the working class is not it's not, first of all, white men. Most of the working class are people of color and women. And this is just, again, vetoed from the history. But back in the old days, back in the 20th century, working class was a bad word. I don't think, I mean, people, you didn't say that word. And you didn't say that word for a couple, at least where I grew up, you didn't say it for a couple of reasons. Working class was kind of a dirty word for middle class people, which I never really thought very much about until I began to recover my bullshit detector, right? Working class was sort of a dirty word. And my parents are great. I've got some folks in here who know my parents. My parents had never, ever told me to look down my nose at anybody, but my entire culture did, right? Somebody who works with their hands especially. Somebody who works, well, a checker at a grocery store, right? A butcher. These folks, you know, maybe a butcher is okay, right? Checker at the grocery store, less. You know, there's this really looking down your nose at people who work for a living. It was considered common or low, right? So it's weird. A lot of people say, oh, I came to college to better myself, which I'm sure most of you have said that. I used to say that. And it's not a terrible thing to say, I guess, right? You know, you're trying to better your condition and so on. But I cringe now. I try not to say it. I try not to say I go to college to better myself, or that I'm helping my students better themselves. Better than what? Right? I mean, that's the thing that comes to me now. Better than the people who are working their butts off to put your butt in that seat. Right? It's not a lot of families in this town, right? They take a couple of kids and they try to slingshot them into that middle class. And then somehow we're supposed to turn around and look down our nose at the folks actually doing the work that actually built the slingshot to put them there. It's a rough one. So this idea of working class, I think we should, you know, reclaim it and revalue that work, of course. It was somehow, when I was a kid, very bad to admit that in America we have a working class. It was somehow a kind of failure. You're supposed to get out of it. You're supposed to move up in the world, and if you're in the working class, there's some kind of moral failing that you have. You've done something wrong that you couldn't make it. You know, these kinds of, I hope I'm not, am I talking out of I mean, this is not, you've heard this stuff before, right? We've had these kinds of conversations before. Yeah. Well, the second way in which the working class was a dirty word was that it was associated with Karl Marx and communism, which actually, you know, the Soviet Union existed. I don't know if you know this, but there was a thing called the Soviet Union in the old days. And that was something, you know, you just don't do it because of this guy right here. Right there we are. Karl Marx, and this guy more significantly, right? So Lenin and all of that. So this was the kind of Cold War chilling effect. And in this country, class was supposed to be invisible. I think in this country more than others. Even when I was a kid, if it ever came up, England, Germany, France, they had classes. We don't, right? We have mobility. Go west. You know, you can go west and get your opportunities and so on. We can, anybody can become a president, right? That was kind of the thing. What's that? The American dream. The American dream, yeah. To get out of, you know, well, maybe later on ask me a question about the American dream. Yeah. All right. I never gave it much thought as a kid, and when I went off to college, it never came up. It was invisible, class was. But when it was finally pointed out to me, I saw it everywhere. I'd never noticed it, because it was like the air we breathe. We're all brought up with a kind of class training. And it really is something once you begin to see it. Now, most of you have probably already seen that. You already kind of know, you're aware of that. But for me, it was a real revelation. Greenville, South Carolina was was the center of the textile industry in the South. The textile industry that fled the Union North in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and established pretty gross, textile workers were the worst paid, shortest living, most malnourished workers in the country. Textile workers were. And I didn't even know that there were textile workers in town until a professor of mine told me. He says, well, you know what you can do every once in a while when you're driving through town? You can turn. Just turn. And you go down a street and you go, oh, wow. And there I saw it. On textile mills have they're mill villages, right? Built in the turn of the 19th, 20th century. Mill villages. There are four rooms in them. They're duplexes, so 2 families, 4 rooms, built by the mill for these workers that they recruited from up in the Piedmont, up in the hills, to come down and work in the mills, making cloth. The rule was everybody in that family had to work in the mill. Unless you're nursing, basically, you're working in the mill. Little kids would work in the mill. They would work as helpers. They didn't even get paid. It's child labor, but it's child helper labor, right? Not even the cheap child labor. So this is the situation there. For 50, 60 years, generations, you get these folks in the mill villages. And the folks that I went to school with, 0, of course, came out of those mill villages. Not a chance. To the people I went to school with at Furman University, soon to be the rulers of South Carolina, and, well, if the mills were still around, they would be the owners of it. These folks were called lint heads. Anybody ever heard that term before? A lint head. Well, that's just a poor white trash lint head. That is, all the cotton dust in the mill gets in your hair. And so you get the lint in your hair. So these lint heads. That's a dumb lint head. You almost never said anything but dumb in front of these names. Again, I was like, that doesn't seem right. But everybody here in my world is saying it. So, But here's the real thing that really just finally made class visible to me. When I went there into that neighborhood, I saw a sign, and that sign said, "Quiet sickness." Quiet sickness, right? And I had seen that sign before and kind of joked about it, right? Oh, what's quiet sickness? They're quiet. It's a sickness. Now, mill workers get brown lung disease. Everybody's heard of black lung disease. Our friends, coal miners, they breathe in all that coal dust and they start coughing up all this black sputum and die from it. It corrupts their lungs. Same is the case with cotton dust. All that lint just doesn't land in your hair. It goes down into your lungs. And over the years, you lose the use of your extremities. Your body can't deliver oxygen to your toes and your fingers. And the way the doctors would handle that is they'd chop off your arms and your legs, right? You got to be amputated. And so those little tiny mill homes that I told you about, they would have ramps on them. And by this time, most of these folks are retired. The mills are done, but these old mill hands are still there. And quiet sickness is sitting there because Grandpa and Grandma, if they sleep in that unair-conditioned house and turn over with brown lung disease, they'll suffocate to death. And so you got to wheel them out onto the front porch, tie them to their chair, and sit them out there at night in the summertime. Quiet, sickness. Well, you know, I mean, and you all have the same story, I'm sure. Each one of you has a story that's similar to that was kind of a shocker to you or a revelation to you, maybe in your own family or in some other place. The thing was, there was no ADA back in the day. The Americans with Disability Act, I think, came in 1996? So this is the 80s, and you could see class right on the landscape. It's right there. You're breathing it. There were two kinds of churches in the Middle Village. There was the Methodist Church, and that's where the foremen and the managers and the owners went. And then there was the Baptist Church, was 5 times the size, and that's where all the workers were. And the Methodist Church paid for the minister of the Baptist Church, right? You know, that kind of thing. And the Methodist Church never had a ramp, and every Baptist church had a ramp. You just see it. It's right there. And, you know, all my life I had seen stuff like this, but then, bam, right in my face, right? And then I learned that in 1934, some of these folks decided to get up the gumption to go on strike in a little tiny town called Honeypath, South Carolina. They joined the nationwide textile strike to finally get some kind of better wages and working conditions. 34 in the depths of the Depression. And they called out the National Guard, and they put machine guns up on the top of those things, and they opened fire on those folks. They killed 7 of them in little tiny Honeypath, which is only 2,000 people even today. 7 of these folks are killed. And their reward, the wife of one of the men shot in the back, one of these guys on the picket line shot in the back, her reward, a lifetime job in the mill. We're sorry we killed your husband. Here, have this job next to the guy who killed him. Right? And so in a way, we do this kind of class invisibility as a way of self-defense, too. Right? Some of this stuff is awful. Of course you veto it from your own history. Of course you bury it. Well, I kind of want to raise it again, though, because for me, at least, just to move away from the world of stories to just the story of learning United States history. Learning United States history class is invisible. Presidents, senators, the way I learned it. Things are changing, I think. They really are a bit. I mean, it's a little bit more open, history is now. But the big business people, there's a big TV show now called The Men Who Built America or something, it's Carnegie, all these kinds of things. Everyone else in the story that I learned was bystanders. History is acted on by history. These folks up here are making history. We're just along for the ride, right? We're observers, spectators of this history. There was a basic unity in the story, too. After all, it's the history of the United States of America, so you can't get too far from unity. But I'm always like, well, wait a second. Don't we sometimes have some kinds of conflicts? And maybe those conflicts, the key thing for me at least, wasn't just that we have conflicts, but sometimes those conflicts are really good. I'm for them. They're not things to be explained away. They're not always bad. They can be ugly and so on in history, but we always say, well, why did the Civil War happen? And for me, sometimes I'm like, why didn't it happen sooner? Why didn't we do this thing? But that's the other thing we say. Well, we haven't had really any big conflicts except, of course, the Civil War. We were conflicted over slavery, and that was solved in 1865. And so that's that for that one, right? This is maybe I'm exaggerating the way your teacher did it, but I don't know. Conflict is something to be explained away. Hopefully that doesn't ring true to you. It certainly doesn't ring true to me. And for me, at least, one of the big conflicts was conflict over these basic questions. These questions right here. Who produces the wealth? how is it produced, and who gets it once it's produced. You can see this so clearly when you talk in early history, right? You got these peasants producing all the wealth, and they deliver half to the landlord and a third to the church, and then for the privilege of doing all the work, they get to keep a third of the stuff they produced. Pretty clear. Those folks are getting screwed, right? It's a much more complicated society now, but I think if you ask these questions about any time and any place, you go a long way to telling the history of that story. Who in that community produces the wealth? Who's producing the wealth? And what I mean by producing the wealth is not just who's at work at some place getting a wage producing the wealth, but I'm talking about whole households and neighborhoods here producing the wealth. Half the population of this country doesn't work for wages at all. A huge portion are elderly, a lot are young. Huge numbers of people spend their time caring for others for free, right? And provisioning households for free. They do this without any wage. But who's doing the work? Who's producing the wealth? How is it produced? Who gets that wealth once it's produced? That's the big question for me, always. And there's always a fight over these things because these things don't happen just naturally. We make up rules to make them happen the way they happen, right? We make up rules about this. The rules for over who produces the wealth, the rules for how it's produced, who gets it, and who makes the rules for all of that are always fought over. I guess the Civil War is one of those, but it's everywhere. A class analysis helps us to explain how that world works. It's not the only way of looking at things. And there are many, as historians always say, it's much more complicated. Or as my wife always says, echoing an old professor of hers when she was a real activist and he was like, oh, shut up, one of those kind of people. It's all very complicated and there's nothing we can do. Right? Well, it is very complicated, and there's always something we can do, right? Well, reading about all this stuff brought me to this guy. All right, we've gone for 35 minutes. Are we okay? Is everybody doing okay? We're following. I think I'm on task this time. Last time I did, I've only got 187 slides here. Okay. They don't know I'm not kidding. First of all, I loved taking the excuse to show a picture of the most beautiful ugly man in the world, E.P. Thompson. Doesn't he just have character in that face? And anyway, E.P. Thompson was the great historian of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and a real activist too, the anti-nuke campaigner and a pro-labor campaigner and all of that kind of stuff, and just one of the greatest historians I've ever come across in my life. But in my world of labor history, and now this book, of course, came out in the 1960s, but it's still like the classic. It's the sun, and then there's all the other moons that circulate around it, right? The making of the English working class. And he says in this, right in the first few pages of the book, so you don't have to read all 700 pages, he talks about class. He says this, very simple statement. I'm seeking to rescue working people from the enormous condescension of posterity. The enormous condescension of posterity. What do you think he means by that? What would be the enormous condescension of posterity against, what's that? Okay, a little bit of that. Yeah, the way you're supposed to treat what happened in the past. You kind of, if you're condescending, aren't you? You're kind of looking down your nose. You're calling them lint heads, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Oh no, not posture. No, posterity is sort of your ancestors. You're the next generation, right? So you're posterity. The history, looking back, as we in the future look back on the past, we condescend to those people. We say, and historians do it in a really simple way. All they do is they say, well, they don't matter. We edit them out of history. We say, okay, well, yeah, of course they existed, but they don't count. Who cares about these guys who smashed stocking frames in the Midlands in England in the the early 1700s? Who cares about these folks who joined up in these radical religious millennial organizations to try to figure out a way to deal with industrial life? They're gone now. They were poor, and their kids were poor. They don't matter. Let's just veto them. And for me, at least, I like this kind of idea. I don't like the word rescue. I'm going to come along and rescue you. But as historians, we do have one job, and it's to tell a story of who done it, right? Who did it? And we always give the wrong people the credit. You wonder about a little bit about the minimum wage or maximum hours and all these things, and we'll talk about it later. We'll talk about our pal Franklin Roosevelt, right? Oh, he did that. No. Who put that on his desk? Who put that agenda on his desk? This is the big question. The enormous condescension of posterity. I even talked about it today or yesterday in my class. I feel bad about it. If anybody's in here, I apologize. I said Crocker, Hopkins, Huntington, Stanford, the Big Four. They're the ones who built the railroad that went through this town. It's easy to say it that way. The Big Four. I don't say they built it, though. I must say that. I do stay away from that. I say they owned the railroad that goes through this town. The Southern Pacific was the Central Pacific, Southern Pacific Railroad. Huntington, Hopkins, Crocker, Stanford. Who built the railroad? These guys. These folks. These folks. Right? And you've heard this now, right? You've heard this story now. My guess is, right, your teachers gave you a little bit of this kind of stuff. Oh yeah, well, Chinese workers came over from southeast China and made their way across to Gold Mountain, California, worked up in the hills building the railroad. Huge numbers died under terrible conditions, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Here's some guys building the railroad. Miners, with an E. Right. More miners. Yeah. Now, a lot of times when we look at these kinds of pictures, we say, well, it was rough. People had to do these things at the time, but thankfully the economy matured, or it developed, or we shifted industries, and therefore we don't have something as vicious as this going on. No, the economy didn't develop. It didn't shift industries. What happened was people struggled and said, hell no, we'll never do this. We're not going to do this anymore. We're going to fight against this. And it took decades to get a Child Labor Act passed in this country. The Supreme Court blocked it for decades. You know why? How one of the arguments of the Supreme Court to let these guys keep on working? Anybody know some of the? Freedom of contract. Yeah, freedom of contract. This little kid here has the right, just like any other man in this world, to negotiate with John D. Rockefeller for his wages and working conditions. How dare you take away his freedom to work 12 hours a day in the dark, 1,000 feet underground? How dare you take away his freedom? What a terrible thing that is to actually have a child labor law. That's one of the arguments. There were all kinds of other arguments. There's some breakers working. There we go. He's a mule driver, so he's a senior worker. You can tell he's a mule driver because he carries the whip. That's his light up there, just in case. I like these three. Yeah, they kind of, these are oyster shuckers in Charleston, South Carolina. If you ever want to look at some of these pictures, just look up Lewis Hine. one of the great photographers of industrial America, but a guy who, when he took these pictures, by the way, we look at them and we go, well, there's some history, there's some, primary sources. No, this is an argument. This picture is an argument. Louis Hine took this picture to put a mirror up to your face and say, see who you are, America? Do you want to be this? Do you want to allow this to happen? And it kind of worked over time. Yeah. Hine, H-I-N-E. I forget his original name. A lot of these radicals, they change their names. Like that guy, what is his name? Joseph Jagvili changed his name to Stalin. Anyway. Historical amnesia. All right. Go back to your notes, Paul. Don't babble on too long. We've got to get this. Whoa, whoops. Yeah, historical amnesia. Bertolt Brecht wrote a great poem about all this stuff. If you've never run across it, I'll just have it right here for you. Do you mind me reading you a poem real quick? Okay. Some people are like, yeah, get on with it. No. Who built Thebes of the seven gates? In the books, you'll find the names of kings. Did the kings haul up the lumps of rock? And Babylon, many times demolished, who raised it up so many times? In what houses of gold glittering Lima did the builders live? Where, the evening that the wall of China was finished, did the masons go? Great Rome is full of triumphal arches. Who erected them? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Had Byzantium much praised in song only palaces for its inhabitants? Even in fabled Atlantis, the night the ocean engulfed it, the drowning still bawled for their slaves. The young Alexander conquered India. Was he alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Did he not even have a cook with him? Philip of Spain wept when his armada went down. Was he the only one to weep? Frederick II won the 7 Years' War. Who else won it? Every page of victory. Who cooked the feast for the victors? Every 10 years, a great man. Who paid the bill? So many reports. So many questions. Who paid the bill? For me, that's a big one. We talk about, I got my New Balance shoes on. I paid a certain amount of money for these things. And you think, okay, all right, I paid $100 for these. I paid, $10 at the thrift store for this. You think about the price of things. Who paid the bill, right? What's the cost of these things? This is one of the things that I think when you begin to start thinking about class and working class history, that's the first thing you think about. Where does the value of something, is it because it costs so much at Neiman Marcus, or is it because at least somewhat, or at least some version of value has to have something to do with the labor that went into it? Who produced that wealth? Under what conditions? And who got it once it was produced? Well, okay. This notion of class power arising out of a history of conflict brings up more questions for me. Has class shaped your life? Have you received class training? And has class been made invisible in your life? Does anybody have? I want to let somebody let me know. Do these seem kind of familiar to you? In some ways, has class shaped your life, or do you think you've had some kind of class training in your life? And if so, can you give me an example? Can somebody offer one? Yeah, way in the back.
So my partner is from Germany, and his family has, they're like bonds, which is like, I don't know, it's like a certain land, right, of region. So although they lived in a mansion, his family survived World War I and II, and they have a lot of the historical artifacts that should be in museums, some of them, but it's saved for history, and the fact that they are able to keep so much of their, they have a lot of furniture, nice wooden, pre-World War I made family heirlooms that were given as forms of payment because his dad was a lawyer, and I was over here thinking like, man, you know how hard it is to get a cosigner? Let alone like have all this money, if they had money available to lend, like 60 grand. But one thing his family and I had in common is that my mom uses like the little glass jars as drinking glasses, like after you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and his mom did the same thing. And that was like where we were able to relate. But it was weird because even though with money they expect, you had to have an education to be accepted by them. Even within their own German, that there's a class difference there. It's very elitist.
I like how you went right to the sort of domestic world and, kinds of furniture that people just sort of grew up in, and now you're in this other world, from this other world there, and you see it as different. Anybody in here ever been to a really, really, really expensive hotel? I mean, that costs $2,000 a night or something like that, and walk into the lobby? Right? Yeah. As a guest or as an employee? Right. Well, even us middle-class people, we know we don't belong there. You just don't belong. You walk in. My partner, Mary, she likes to do this. She likes to go in to really expensive hotel lobbies and walk in like she owns the place. And you sit down and you order water, right? And it's like, damn it. This is my place just as much as it is yours, you snooty little, it's that kind of thing. But of course, I know I don't belong, so I'm always looking around, when are they going to come and get me, right? That kind of thing, right? You had an example, yeah.
I was going to say, like, part of the experience as far as class training has to do with, like, my coaching. How I talk to my friends who grew up working class versus in a professional setting or in a classroom. My vernacular is not the same.
Yeah.
As what I talk to them.
We all shapeshift, don't we? To different, different languages. Let me tell you a story about and then I'll leave it be with this, and we'll move to the story of wealth, and then get into history in the second hour. But here, we haven't gone 2 hours, have we? No, okay, all right. I have a buddy who went to a private boarding school called Cranbrook. Some of you may have heard of that. It's near Detroit. It's where Ford and all the auto people sent all their kids, right? It's where Daniel Ellsberg went to school and got slingshotted into the top levels of, State Department stuff. He later he was a turncoat, right? Pentagon Papers and all that stuff. Our buddy Mitt Romney went to this school. These people are trained to be Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Vice President, President, Senator. That's how they're trained. This guy that I know went to that school, 8th grade. Now, imagine your 8th grade social studies class, and now let me paint a scene for you. Very first day of class, 100 young 8th grade boys sitting out in the audience, and the headmaster comes out, and he has a globe in his hand. And he walks out, and he says, "Men," to 8th grade boys, "men, welcome to Cranbrook. This is the earth. It is yours. In your years here, we will teach you how to make it act." How many of you had that? Your 8th grade social studies teacher said that to you? No, what your social studies teacher said is, you're going to be acted upon, and here's how. No, I shouldn't say it. Can you imagine that? I heard that story, but there is a world of people that's the case. You go to San Francisco, you go to the top floor, the 50th floor. You've done this, right? You've gone to the 50th floor to the overlook and one of these big skyscrapers. You take the elevator up, and there's a little public space way up there if you've been to Chicago or New York or anything. And you look down, and the people look like what? Ants. Yeah. But if you're raised on the 50th floor, you are an ant. I shouldn't say it that way. Now I'm getting into class jealousy and anger or something like that. Anger can be power, though. Well, anyway. I think class in a capitalist society has something to do with the power that comes from ownership of wealth. We've been talking a bit about income, and I would say when we talk about income, we're actually kind of missing the boat a bit. Wealth. These folks who have this generational wealth sitting in their house, the wealth that accumulates in the pockets of some very few people. We've got giant money funnels around, and some people have their mouth right at the spout of that money funnel. Wealth. The golden rule, right? What's the golden rule? Exactly. He who has the gold makes the rules. And now that's not, like I said, it's all complicated. But there's a piece of this here, all right? And many Americans act like we don't even have classes, which kind of helps when people want to make the rules. They veil themselves, in a sense, in this notion of an already egalitarian classless society. Here's a little thing about wealth that I think is kind of interesting. We have a very typically poor idea of who has wealth in this country. There was a survey done. Now, this was 12 or 13 years ago. I think we're much smarter now. 2011 Americans were dumb. We're geniuses. But here you go. Let me give you a little explanation of what's going on here. It's about, they surveyed all kinds of people and said, all right, what would be ideal? How much of the total wealth should the richest people own versus how much of the total wealth, the second, 20% of people own versus how much the poorest of the poor should own. So the poorest of the poor here, they interviewed lots and lots of people. The bottom 20%, they should own about 10% of the wealth. They're poor. Some of them are probably lazy. They don't deserve it. They didn't save the money. Okay, all right. So they don't deserve it. I mean, they're poor. So all right. So we need to have some inequality in this society. That's what most people seem to think here. And the very, very rich, the top 20%, should have somewhere around 35% of the wealth. Then they asked this other question. Not just what do you think it should be, but what do you think it is? What do you think the wealth of this country is? And they came up with this one. We think that the richest 20% have about twice as much stuff than they ought to. Right? The richest 20% have about 60% of the wealth, we think, and they shouldn't have all that wealth. And then the poor are only sitting there with 2 or 3%, and the next 20% are only sitting there with 8%, and the next 20%, now we're getting to 60%, the green here. 60% only has 20% of the wealth, right? So that's bad. It should be more egalitarian than that. You know what's coming next, don't you? Right? The reality. Where's the light blue and purple lines? They don't own anything. This is a capitalist society. I mean, it's right there in the name, capitalism. And 40% don't have any capital. Those with the gold make the rules. The bottom 40%, nothing. What they've got is maybe a house, but they've got more debts than they've got assets is what they've got. But a lot of people are just desperately poor, right? They got all that credit card debt. They're just to survive. That's the actual. And I think it's hard for ordinary folks. It's hard for me. I still can't grasp it. I think it's hard for us to grasp what great fortunes are. What are great fortunes? You and I, we get our money and we spend it on rent, we spend it on food. If we're rich, we spend it on luxury goods. We spend it on a nice mansion, maybe a yacht if we're really rich, got lots and lots of income coming in. But these aren't fortunes. These aren't fortunes at all. We think about our wealth as income. No, wealth is power. The really, really super wealthy in this world, they control whole, not just lives, but whole communities, whole regions with the decisions people make. Privately held wealth makes massive investment decisions that destroys or increases the joy of lots of people's lives. And they do it because they want to do it that way, not because any of us have a say in it. I like this one. Isn't this a great one? Quick word on fortunes. I show this to some of my students. Sometimes I show this one to my students. I haven't done that this term, but I like that one. All these workers keeping the flood out, right? But people like, you've heard of this guy, right? Andrew Carnegie. And then there he is giving away all his money. Where did I get all that money? Well, did you know that steel workers in Carnegie Steel worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 2 weeks straight, and then worked a 24-hour shift while the other shift got 1 day off, and then they took a day off and the day after, and then they switched shifts like that and worked the next 2 weeks? That's how they made steel in this country. 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 2 weeks straight, and then 1 day off after a 24-hour shift. You got to keep that steel mill running. You can never turn it off. Collis P. There's Huntington. Not Henry Huntington, the guy that everything around here is named after, but his uncle. When his uncle died, Henry Huntington married his uncle's widow, and they married the fortune back together. Good move there. Fortunes. We'll skip these guys. But, there's J.P. Morgan getting mad at somebody. Big banker, right? All of these guys had fortunes. Andrew Mellon, aluminum. Alcoa, Tennessee. My grandparents are from near Alcoa, Tennessee. It's a Twin City place, and every year we'd go down to Alcoa. Alcoa was as far as you could see industry, right? 7 miles by 7 miles, one giant plant. Just incredible. All gone now, but of course, there's this guy, right? Made his fortune in mining, actually. He inherited his fortune from George Hearst, his father, and parlayed mining. And, by the way, you ever wonder why his newspapers editorialized a lot against Mexico, saying we need to go to war against Mexico? That was his favorite thing to except, that in Japan. He editorialized it against it a lot. Why? Because the Mexican Revolution took 7 million acres from him. They took some of his wealth. Cigarettes. And there's our guy. There, right? John D. Rockefeller, billionaire. First billionaire in all of American history. There you go. Now, that's a fortune. Now, I keep on saying, I keep on saying, we think of, money as just income and stuff, but these guys think of it differently. And it's like, it's just more money. They just buy bigger houses and bigger yachts and so on. No. They buy this, right? They create kingdoms, empires of capital. And it's not just the United States of America. Now, I don't want to spend all our time here. I told you we would spend time on workers, and now I'm going back to these guys that I complained about. But let me give you a little hint of some of the fortune. This is Vanderbilt, who's one of the richest guys. Let me give you a little hint about Vanderbilt's wealth, because just imagine, this is a crumb from this guy's table. In the shipping and big railroad, New York Central, right? This is a crumb from his table. You have a full-time staff there, and then you show up every few months. Because you got another place. You don't have just the breakers. You've got Hyde Park, your Hyde Park mansion up there near, up on the Hudson River. And then you've got, of course, he's got a family to house. He's got several kids and mistresses and all that kind of stuff. But, there's another one, New York City. And then, of course, you go to Newport. That was the place where all the rich went, Newport, Rhode Island. And then you got this one here, the Petit Chateau. Another one in Manhattan, in New York City. And then the Triple Palace, which was rented out later on by Henry Clay Frick, the right-hand man of Carnegie. Then you've got your nice little hunting cottage lodge, and then you've got this one. And then this one. Got to give New Jersey some love, folks. New Jersey needs. And then, of course, once you're done with all that, you go down to Asheville, North Carolina. You buy up 25,000 acres and build the biggest house in the country, and then you never live in it. Right? 260 rooms. Anybody been to the Biltmore? Yeah, it's pretty cool, isn't it? Yeah, it's something else. These are crumbs. I mean, I'm trying to get you an idea of what a fortune is. Let's do wealth distribution today. And then we'll take about 2 minutes after we do wealth distribution today. We'll take 2 minutes to maybe stretch and talk to each other for a moment, or 4 minutes, and then we'll come back and I'll see. You probably wanted some more history. I'll give you some history later on. Let's map it out. There's the Tower Theater. There's the ticket booth of the Tower Theater. Let's do this. Imagine that you're standing at the ticket booth outside the Tower Theater and everyone arranged themselves according to wealth. So you're standing there at the ticket booth, and let's say that the poorest people in the country are closest, those with no wealth at all, right? And the richer folks they take a step away. Well, I've got $10,000, so I get 1 foot. So let's say 1 foot, $10,000. Okay, we're doing the math. Here we go with math. Right. So everybody owns $50,000 or less would be between you and, well, between me and you. Everybody in the country at 50,000 or less, that circle right there, which by the way is to scale. I did, the things I do for you. There we go. 35% of the country, so 120 million people in a circle that with a radius is between me and you. Circle right here, 120 million people. There you go, 1/3 of the country, right here. Pretty crowded. 10,000 equals 1 foot. Let's go 10 feet out. So you're to the curb, maybe. Almost to the curb of the Tower Theater. 50% of the country is in that circle. That's 160 million people in that circle right there. You see what I'm doing, right? Everybody following along? Let's do another one. Let's go to $1 million, because 90% of the country has less than $1 million. 10% has $1 million or over. 10% has $1 million and over, and there we're in the parking lot. We're almost to Chicken Pie Shop. Millionaires are right there knocking on the boarded up Chicken Pie Shop. There we go. Now we've got the 1%. 10 million bucks. 1% of the country is outside this circle. 317 million are inside this circle. Almost nobody owns $10 million worth of stuff in this country. Almost every single person owns less. All right? That's where we are. We're not even close to City College. We're still blocks away. Right? Now, where's Jeff Bezos? Houston, Texas. Yeah, I had students. I always hope for a Sanger, because then I can say, well, yeah, Bezos putting the anger back in Sanger, right? Anyway. But I just love saying that, anger back in Sanger. Anyway, Jeff Bezos, yeah, owner of Amazon. Or remember, 99% of Americans, around 320 million people, are within this circle. 3.2 million people stand outside of it. How big would the circle have to be to include Bezos? Well, here it is. Hell of a lot further than Texas. And that's him at $200 billion. I think he makes a little more. He's got a little more than that now. Plus, he got a divorce. Remember, he got a divorce. But if he had stayed married, he'd be in Spain. But he's not the richest guy yet, is he? Who do we need to talk about now? Musk. Elon Musk. I mean, can you imagine a more Lex Luthor name than Elon Musk? I mean, you guys, he told you who he was, right? There he is. $417.9 billion. I looked it up today. 1 foot is $10,000. So how many of those feet do we go to get to $417.9 billion? We go, it's weird because you can't even draw the circle on the map. right? We go all the way, to Saudi Arabia. This area is I guess for, I don't know, somebody who has more than $500 billion. Notice this too. Another way to think about it, if you made $500 an hour, $1 million per year, which none of you do, $1 million per year, you'd have to work for 417,900 years to accumulate as much wealth and not spend any of it, to accumulate as much wealth as Elon Musk has. And people always say to me, well, it's hard to liquidate that kind of wealth. It's very difficult to do that. We can't, it's not really money. It's, yeah, it isn't money. It's power. It's power. It's power that these folks have. So how did Bezos and Musk get all that wealth? A lot of people try to tell you that they earned it. This is a different, yeah, I think maybe a little. I mean, folks, let's give every single bit of benefit of the doubt and say that Musk is the smartest person ever, and that he's the hardest working person ever. Let's say he works at least 1,000 times as hard as you, right? And that he's 1,000 times as smart as you. Hard work doesn't have anything to do with this, folks. Hard work is not, notions of earning and hard work are not enough to explain how someone can accumulate that much wealth. The way you can accumulate that much wealth is you've got a society, us, that have set up rules for who produces the wealth, how it's produced, and who gets it once it's produced, that allow him to do that. We say, okay, you can do it. Perhaps part of the answer has to do with the rules that we've set up about wealth. Right? But those rules are often invisible. We say it's the natural order of things. We say, these are the laws of the economy. We do all that kind of stuff. But it's put on your bullshit detector. That's just clearly, that cannot be the case. If it was the case, why in the world is it happening now and not 30 years ago? Now, we've always had huge numbers of really wealthy people, but I mean, we had that Carnegie and Rockefeller, and they're incredibly wealthy, but we did reduce some of these folks' power for a couple of generations, which is a great victory in world history, I think. And a lot of that wealth turned into incomes for working people who actually produced the stuff for a while. With all the problems America has, we did have a bit of that. But we've got historical amnesia about it. We used to have those folks. Remember Carnegie and Rockefeller. Now, he only had $1 billion. But if you actually take a look at the amount of power that $1 billion wielded in, let's say, 1890 America, and you said, all right, how much money would you have to have in order to wield that much power in 2025 America? The answer is Rockefeller's billion is basically $1.7 trillion. 1.7 trillion bucks. See me about the greatest website in the world that deals with all this stuff. All these great historians working on it. There's Rockefeller, right? Yeah, I mean, you just can't do it. So there were movements that challenged that kind of power. I think people saw it much more clearly than some of us see it today. People saw it because they saw it hadn't existed before. And it grew up in their midst, and they're like, what is going on? What the hell? We're supposed to have some kind of republic here where one person's voice should count just as much as anybody else's, but these folks are drowning us out. We need to pull back some of that power. We need to wrest some of that power from them. So anyway, I'm going to talk in the last 45 minutes about a few events where people did do that. But it's not going to end pretty or anything. Now, my guess is a lot of you have heard about the Haymarket affair, the Haymarket riot, so it's called. Back in the 1880s, one of the biggest problems that ordinary working people had was that problem that I raised when I talked about the steel mills, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 2 weeks straight, 24-hour shift. Hours were a problem. Part of the thing about the 8-hour day was you could almost consider it a kind of crusade, almost a religious kind of thing. And that song that Pete Seeger was playing, that guy sounds like a guy raised with a silver spoon in his mouth who went to Harvard, who's now singing a song that minors might sing, right? Doesn't he sound a little bit? I kind of like him anyway. He's sweet, I love, what's wrong with Pete Seeger, right? But imagine 10,000 people singing that. 8 hours, we'd have, that kind of thing. One of the things that I don't quite understand these days is why we haven't. Well, we had the 8-hour day movement, and it lasts for decades. We don't get it for a long, long time, and then we stop trying to get any better. I'm part of the. I used to be part of the work less party. 4 hours a day. Let the robots do it, right? Workers of the world, relax. I think the 8-hour day movement and the 10-hour day movement that happened 50 years earlier in America, I think those movements, those workers recognized something that I think was that it's hard for us to understand today because we've totally lost this one, and that is that wages themselves are a crime, and the fewer hours you work for wages, the more free you are. Wages themselves are a crime. All these working people's organizations back in the late 19th century, huge numbers of them, talked about getting rid of the wage system. We're for free labor. Not free labor as in slaves working for free, but free people laboring under their own volition, not taking orders from anybody else, even for money. Not renting yourself to somebody. And I think that's what a lot of the 8-hour day movement, the 10-hour day movement, and the 8-hour day movement was about. It was about, we want to be free, and the only way to be free is to not be at work, working under somebody else's command, even if we get paid good wages, right? And I think we've kind of forgotten that, and one of these days it'd be nice to bring that back. The idea of just, we should be free. Well, a lot of these folks back in the 1880s, in 1886, the organization that I'm part of, I'm a member of, the American Federation of Labor, it was formed in 1886, and before it formed, its precursor organization said, on May 1st, 1886, the 8-hour day will be the law of the land. And they didn't mean a law from the government or anything. They said this is how long we're going to work, and if you want to work us any more than 8 hours a day, we quit. We're going to go on strike. And so May 1st, 1886 became, you can imagine, it's building to May 1st, 1886. Are we going to go out? Are we going to stay in? And in many different cities throughout the country, this was a huge movement. In Milwaukee and St. Louis and Chicago, Cincinnati, these industrial cities all the way through the what we call the Rust Belt today, right? Chicago was the big one, though. In Chicago, there was already a strike going on. The McCormick Reaper plant was on strike. This is International Harvester later on in life, right? Which, by the way, just so you know, a great book by Tony Gilpin about the farm equipment workers at International Harvester for decades and decades and decades. Radical union, reactionary employer, fight, long, deep grudge. Just really something else. Brand new book, just so you know. Well, back in 1886, McCormick Reaper plant, they're on strike. The police come. There's a fight, happens a lot. The police shoot down 4 of the workers on the picket line. They kill them. Not terribly unusual in this time. Between 1880 and 1914, troops were brought out some 500 times to put down strikes. National Guard, militia, that 500 times here in the United States. The first big strike was, the first national strike was the railroad strike of 1877, and over 100 people were killed to force them back to work in that strike. So, I mean, this is a bloody, bloody affair. So 4 of these workers are killed at McCormick Reaper plant. Some folks in the Chicago radical movement, mainly anarchists, they get together and they say, well, what we need to do is have a protest of this. We can't let this happen. We can't let this go without a fight. And so they call a big rally at the Haymarket. That's why we see this picture here. And you can see the illustration here, right? This is Harper's Magazine, utterly against any workers getting an 8-hour day, and certainly against anarchists. Harper's Magazine is basically saying, look at these dirty, smelly coffeehouse types, these anarchists throwing bombs. What happened? What happened? They had a big rally. Thousands of people were there. The mayor came, tipped his hat, said, hey there, I'm going to have the votes of the anarchists. And actually, yeah, I mean, there were all kinds of political, strains there. So late at night, it's starting to rain. The crowd is leaving. It's pretty much done. And the police decide to send in 600 cops into what's left of the rally, ordering them to disperse. Somebody, nobody knows who, threw a bomb into the ranks of the police. Killed 2 people right away. Police take out their guns. They start shooting. As far as we don't know if the bomb killed anybody else. It looks like the cops killed 6 more of their own, so 8. And then a whole bunch of other people were killed, a whole bunch of people who were now running and panicking in the so-called, this is what's called the Haymarket riot. And what it did was kind of tinged the 8-hour day movement with this radicalism. And this is our first Red Scare. An attempt to create an 8-hour day is sort of interrupted by this uprising here, and then an incident is used by the powers that be to basically crush the entire movement. Especially, well, not the anarchists, especially the Knights of Labor, which was the biggest union in the country at the time, and actually officially was against strikes, but they used this incident to destroy the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor had over a million people in it at the time. It was illegal to pretty much join a union. You'd get fired, certainly. So a million people, this is one of the biggest early unions we ever had, and it's going to be crushed after this. But the thing that we remember about 1886 and May 1st, well, this was May 4th is when this finally happens. The next day, by the way, in Milwaukee, 6 more people are killed by cops as they're protesting for the 8-hour day. This is not just in Chicago, but this becomes famous because the people who organized this, the 8 anarchist guys, mostly immigrant Germans, who organized this, they were all railroaded into jail. And they were tried and convicted of basically causing the deaths of those cops. None of them, we know that none of them did it. None of them killed anybody. They're the only ones we know didn't do it because they were up on the platform haranguing the crowd, talking and stuff. We know they didn't do it. On top of that, there are a couple of them who weren't even there. And they turned themselves in the trial to sort of make it into a cause and everything, and ended up getting the death penalty for it. 4 of them were hanged. One more guy had a blasting cap smuggled into his prison and blew his own head off. And the other 3 are sitting there in prison, rotting. And the question is, what do we do? Do we kill them too? I mean, these guys, they're in there and they've got the death penalty because of their political beliefs. Not because of anything they've done, but because of their political beliefs and because they were part of this movement for an 8-hour day. And so an entire worldwide movement develops. In England, this is a Walter Crane illustration. In England, like, we need to save the anarchists of Chicago. In France, in Italy, in Russia, in Argentina, in Mexico, all over the world, people say we need to save the Haymarket the Haymarket martyrs. And John Peter Altgeld of Illinois finally does pardon them, ruining his political career. That's why I put him up here. There he does the right thing. They didn't kill anybody. Let's let them go. The Haymarket Martyrs Memorial. Now, the whole world mobilized to free these last three folks. The whole world, by the way, when one of them died, his epitaph on his gravestone was "Killed by capitalism." So when this movement all happened, the whole world mobilized, and they began to say, all right, well, what we need to do is have International Workers' Day commemorate the 8-hour day movement in America and these guys. So they said, all right, we're going to celebrate International Workers' Day on May 1st. May 1st is the day of International Workers' Day. And if you go anywhere in the world today on May 1st, go to Mexico City on May 1st, go to Paris on May 1st, go anywhere in the world on May 1st, and you'll see sometimes millions of people out celebrating International Workers' Day. Here in America, Labor Day. Now that said, there already was some effort to make a Labor Day in September, but clearly now, this Labor Day, May 1st, that's going to, you know, when I was a kid, they always had the May Day parades in China and in the Soviet Union, and even in capitalist countries, they had the May Day parade and everything. And I, never knew that they were commemorating something that happened here in Chicago. Not there, but here. A way of vetoing it here. The day will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you are throttling today, said Albert Parsons, just as he was being killed. Albert Parsons. That's a cool picture, isn't it? Look at that picture. I wish we could turn down. You see the light coming in. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah, it's wonderful, wonderful picture. Yeah, there we go. Everybody makes a pilgrimage to this place. This is the cemetery in Chicago where these guys are, but also Emma Goldman's there, if you're familiar with Emma Goldman. And Albert Parsons was one of the guys killed, but his wife, Lucy Parsons, went on to be an activist for the rest of her life. She died in the 1940s, right? 50 years later. There she is, Lucy Parsons. And there's her grave. But that 8-hour day movement goes on and on and on. Anybody know when we got the law, the national law, the federal law that says, all right, 8 hours a day? Anybody know when that came in? This is 1886, 1938, 52 years later. I'm in graduate school. I'm reading this book that's due on Monday, right? You got to read a book a week in every class in graduate school, right? So it's a 400, 500-page book. It's weekend. My buddy calls me up and says, hey, Paul, what are you doing, man? What are you doing this weekend? And I go, well, I'm reading a book, man. I got 500 pages to read. He goes, what are you talking about, man? People died for the 40-hour week. Well, it's funny, but it's also, every once in a while I'm like, maybe I shouldn't. Yeah, you should work 40 hours a week to stop scabbing on the unemployed. 40 hours a week. Anyway, all right. But you get a sense of it, back and forth, back and forth. When labor gets strong, they're able to secure some of these things, but there's no permanent victories. In the story of labor history, no permanent victories. The United Mine Workers sometimes get the 8-hour day, and then they almost disappear completely. And then they have almost every coal miner in the country, and then they have almost none. It goes back and forth for decades. It's always a time of rebuilding. We talk about this for our. The few times Dylan and I have talked, we talk about the rebuilding the labor movement and all that kind of stuff. And I think sometimes when we talk about it, we act as if this is a new thing, right? But you're in constant renewal, constant renewal, constant renewal. Of course, another spot, and the reason why I'm talking about these big-time moments here is maybe you're familiar with them, but they also have a kind of a couple. Each one might be able to say something, I guess. One, we had these radicals here, but the 8-hour day, if you recall, nobody thinks that's radical anymore, right? Those guys were considered radical. And yet, nobody considers that radical anymore, the 8-hour day, right? Another event that is key for our story here, again, this is 6 years later. Some of you might have heard of this, the Homestead Strike. The Homestead Strike. Homestead, Pennsylvania was Carnegie's sort of jewel in his crown. It was his most advanced mill. It was, this was the place. Thousands and thousands of people working there, making steel every day. They were part of a union, the Amalgamated Iron and Steel Workers, and they've got a 50-page contract with all kinds of rules. This is a story, and people tell this story in many different ways, but one of the things that I think is kind of important, even though we've got only 20 minutes, one of the things that I think is kind of important about the story of labor is the story for fighting for power, not just for better wages and working conditions and all that kind of stuff. This is power on the shop floor. This story is power on who has the right on the shop floor to determine how the work should be done? We're producing the wealth. Remember the questions. Who produces the wealth? How is it produced? We're producing the wealth. How's it going to be produced? Well, you know the way Carnegie got the wealth, the steel produced? He had a big bunch of money in his pocket, and he put up the money for building this kind of stuff. And then to pay these guys, what you do at the beginning is you go to one of their, a group of their leaders, and you hand them a big pile of cash and go, give me steel. He didn't know how to make steel. A lot of these steel makers that we talk about, they didn't know how to make steel. Steel workers knew how to make steel. And then you all, as a gang of workers at a steel mill, would figure out, okay, well, your job, we know your job, and you're an apprentice, and we're going to set up our own rates, and we're going to set up our own pace, and we're going to determine how much steel we're going to produce. And Carnegie will get his steel. He just needs to keep his nose out of our business, which is this steel mill. I mean, can you imagine such a thing today? Right? The autonomy at work that's there. That's exactly why that strike happened. And it wasn't a strike, it was a lockout. Carnegie said, we own the mill. We own the mill. These workers are claiming that they actually have a say over how the steel is made. We, management, has the right to tell you what to do. When I say do something, you do it. You ever ask that question? Why does the boss get to tell you what to do? And your answer obviously is, well, they're the boss, right? No. This was the fight of the 19th century, fighting over who has power on the shop floor. What Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man, did was he built a giant fence around the entire mill, and then he hired hundreds of Pinkerton detectives, in other words, an army, a private army, to come down the river and move non-union men into the plant. So all these thousands of people, the entire city came out, and they said, we're not going to let you land. So they shot at them. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had a question.
Yeah.
Steel is made from high levels of carbon.
Yeah, steel is all kinds of stuff. It's less brittle. In other words, if you have iron and if you have something made out of iron, and you want to run a railroad on it, it will carry that weight, but then it'll break. And steel has this wonderful ability, because you burned out some of the carbon, to make a little bend in it. It won't bend when you knock it on somebody's head. Yeah, very high. Yeah. Well, low level carbon, actually. There's a great book on it called Nation of Steel by Thomas Misa. And he talks about defining what steel is. But this is the place. Well, they have a big shootout. The workers actually win this one. The Pinkertons surrender, but the whole point of this was to bring in the troops, which is what they ended up doing. They bring in the troops. They occupy Homestead. and the union is crushed, and there's no union in steel in this country to speak of for 40 more years. 40 more years. It's at this point that we get 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 2 weeks straight. This is when this comes in. We won. Screw you. Now you're working more, right? And for less. Yeah, there you go, Carnegie, the great philanthropist. My dad's hometown, Wheeling, West Virginia, said, we refuse one of your stupid libraries, Carnegie. There's got to be one place on this green earth where Andrew Carnegie can't get a monument to his wealth. All right. So that's a shop floor fight. Another fight that I think is kind of important, I'm just going through the highlights, folks. Okay, is that okay? Are we doing okay still? All right. So another fight, so we talked about these radicals, and now we talked about these folks going for shop floor control. By the way, that's what I'm fighting for as a union rep on my here. I'm the grievance guy for State Center Federation of Teachers 1533, and one of the things that always gets me when people say, well, we want more money, I'm fine with getting more money. I always want more money. I love that. That's a great idea. I'm jealous of wealthy people. They have more money. It's nice. I want more. I do. But if we're going to get more money and give up power to do it, no way, right? You try not ever to do that. So, that's the lesson of Homestead for me, at least, a piece of it there. Eugene Debs is an example of what's called industrial unionism, which is kind of a forgotten kind of moment here. Industrial unionism, that is, we're not going to organize along lines of skill. There's still this debate goes on within labor, right? Are we going to organize along lines of skill? Well, you're a carpenter and you're a boilermaker and you're a machinist and you're whatever skill you have. Are we going to organize along those lines? Or if you're a railroad worker, why don't you just join the Railroad Workers Union? Whether you're an engineer, a trainman, a brakeman, or a fireman, whatever, why don't you just join that? Industrial unionism. The thing about industrial unionism, though, that was potentially so radical, not in the case of the railroad unions so much, but in many other unions, was you would bring in huge numbers of workers who were otherwise frozen out of the American Federation of Labor, which was organized along lines of skill, right? Those were a lot of times in the late 19th and early 20th century, a kind of white job trust. White men would have those jobs. But the so-called unskilled jobs, which I'm sure, as you know, aren't really that unskilled most of the time, a lot of the unskilled jobs were done by new immigrants who are coming in, and women, and sometimes children, but unions, of course, no children at all. But let's organize women, very often people of color. At the most, the union movement had just as much kind of racism in it as almost any other part of American society. But where they're at the cutting edge of interracial solidarity was in the industrial union movement, bringing in all of these different workers, even if they don't have skills. The IWW is the extreme example of it. Industrial workers of the world, everybody in one big union will have one big strike and take it over. Right? Yeah, the Wobblies. Yeah. But industrial unionism, to me at least, this is learning about solidarity. There's a lot of kind of snootiness within the working class, right? My job is more skilled than yours, and all this. I do more work than this kind of biting at each other. But industrial unionism kind of brings everybody, hopefully, under one. Eugene Debs helped to form the ARU, the American Railway Union, basically saying if you work with anything having to do with a railroad, you can be part of our union. And in 1893, they had a big strike against Jay Gould's line, and they won. And so hundreds of thousands of people join up, which is a problem if you're in a union. You don't know what to do with them. I wish we had these problems. During their convention in 1894, a plant, the people who made the rich people's luxury train cars, the Pullman plant, where they make all these luxury train cars. These folks lived in a company town, and George Pullman cut their wages and kept the rent the same. Right? And they said, well, we're done. It was during a depression. We got to go out on strike over this. We can't do it. So these folks walk out. Right? And here's a great act of solidarity, I think. The ARU, Eugene Debs' ARU, votes, we're not going to move any Pullman cars. They weren't on strike. They were not going to move any Pullman cars until George Pullman sits down with these workers in Pullman, Illinois. That's it. And so what was this little local strike becomes a strike like that. Because as soon as somebody says, hey, you got a train comes into the yard, and now your job is to put that Pullman car on a new train or something. No, we're going to decouple it. We're going to move it off to a siding, put the train back together, and send it on its way with no Pullman car. Well, the manager comes in and says, you're fired, right? Well, I'm a member of the ARU, or I'm a member of one of the brotherhoods, too. Actually, they were dual unionists sometimes. And so you're fired. Well, and that means all the rest of you go, well, you can't fire our brother. You know, we're hitting the road, too. So now, nationwide strike. There they are walking out. There it is 2 years ago when I was there. Doesn't look quite the same, does it? I mean, the actual thing is there, but the whole thing's destroyed. So what happens here? Well, at the highest level, the Attorney General of the United States, our friend Richard Olney, railroad lawyer and Attorney General, and conflict of interest be damned. That's why I'm Attorney General, because I'm a railroad lawyer, right? He works with some judges and helps them write an injunction against these folks. So a judge says, look, you can't engage in this boycott anymore, you ARU folks. This judge says, he says to the leaders of the union, read what he says here. I'm going to pass an edict from the bench saying that none of you can compel or induce by threats, intimidation, persuasion, force, violence, railway employees to refuse or fail to perform their duties. Now, okay, violence, all those kinds of things are in there. But do you see one word in there? Persuasion. Hey, join us. Join us. Don't move that car. Don't move that Pullman car. You know what happens to me if I do that? To jail with no trial. This is violating an injunction. No trial. To jail I go. To jail Eugene Debs goes. To jail the entire leadership goes. And then they use the excuse of is a Gatling gun on paper is what they called it. Here's the whole injunction. You can read it real quick, and then we'll go on. Yeah, all right. The definition of interference was left up to the railroad. Are they interfering? Yeah, they're interfering. Well, okay, we'll pull the injunction. Now, judges are going to use this thousands of times over the next 30 years. Thousands of times. Injunctions to stop people from just talking to each other. I thought I had a First Amendment right to be able to ask somebody. No. They send in the troops. Dozens are killed. The strike is ended. Eugene Debs goes to prison. Meanwhile, there were riots. Here's our soon-to-be president of the United States, Judge William Howard Taft. Word comes tonight that 30 men have been killed by the federal troops. Though it's a bloody business, everybody hopes that it is true. Won't that be great? We got to kill these people to get them back to work. This is in a letter to his wife, just so you know. And then the next day he writes to her, he's all ticked off. Why? The Chicago situation is not much improved. They've only killed 6. This is hardly enough to make an impression. We got to get these folks. Well, they ended up killing a bunch more, so he got what he wanted. Eugene Debs was in jail. He came out of jail. He converted to socialism, and he's going to run for president 4 different times, winning his most votes in 1912, but winning 1 million from prison in 1920. So when everybody said, you would never vote for, talking about Trump, you'd never vote for somebody for president from prison, I go, well, I would. All right? That's his jail cell door. I went to his house. You can see right there, I went to his house. Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah. Yeah. The Supreme Court said, yeah. The Supreme Court said this is okay to do. And for the next 40 years, we've got this incredible weapon in the hands of sympathetic judges. It's amazing to me to see the incredible amount of fight in labor when you're up against this. You're up against troops, you're up against cops, you're up against private armies, you're up against arsenals that the major firms all purchased. You're up against the law. It really is something. For decades and decades, labor fought without the protection of law. Labor was seen as a conspiracy, as you can see from this. It's something to remember. I don't want labor law to go away, but it's something to remember. Labor survived and grew without the law protecting them. I never want it to go away. I like to have that protection. I don't want to go get in fights and it's awful, that kind of system. But labor solidarity helps even without the law. West Virginia, we have the same kind of story. Now here, I'm going to just go to this book right here. This book is amazing, y'all. I thought I knew some of this stuff, right? The Devil is in These Hills, and James Green, a pretty famous labor historian. This is the story of trying to organize West Virginia mine workers. Now, you want to talk about a place. America is supposed to be free, and everybody has a different version of that word, free, right? But how about this? Every single county in southern West Virginia was basically captured by United States Steel. They owned all the coal mines in southern West Virginia. The United Mine Workers had a toehold in northern West Virginia, and they wanted to organize workers in southern West Virginia so that they could protect their own wage rates that wouldn't be undercut. And so they decided to go and start organizing in southern West Virginia. The second a United Mine Worker organizer would step into any one of those counties, they'd be immediately arrested and thrown in prison until they left town. Well, they'd get the crap kicked out of them, usually, and run out of town on a rail. But if they're lucky, they get arrested and thrown in prison. That was the deal. Why? An injunction. You cannot go down and talk to any of these folks who work in these mines and ask them to join a union. Why? They've signed a contract saying they'll never join a union. Yellow dog contract, which thankfully is illegal now. But that's what they had to do to get a job. And because they did that, I, who never signed such a contract, can't say, hey, you want to join the union? I get thrown in prison for that. There was martial law in those places. They did not have freedom. They did not have democracy at all. And it was the union that brought them democracy. Now, that union fought, folks. We're not talking kumbaya, sit-ins. We're talking guns. There was a war in West Virginia. And I'm not saying we need to take up arms or anything. They had one, if you've ever seen the movie Matewan, that's a true story about this whole larger thing where Sid Hatfield is one of their own law enforcers, is one of the only supporters of the union. They don't do it in the movie, but Sid Hatfield is murdered on the steps of another courthouse a couple of years later in cold blood by Baldwin Felts detectives. They just pulled out their guns and shoot him and his friend. Nobody ever arrested because we didn't have anything like democracy in America. That's why. Now, once they finally pushed through in the late 1920s and early 30s and finally won the union there, they brought democracy to West Virginia. That's my dad's family. That's my dad's world. He wasn't a miner minister, right? This is where you get Mother Jones, right? Remember Mother Jones? You've probably all heard of Mother Jones. I feel bad that magazine that exists now, it's not nearly radical enough for Mother Jones, let me tell you. Whatever your fight, don't be ladylike. God Almighty made women, and the Rockefeller gang of thieves made the ladies, right? I like that one. Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. This was her kind of toughness. 1830 to 1930. Let's skip ahead, though. We actually tested out our Air Force for the first time on these miners as they were marching to southern West Virginia, and the federal government flew planes over and bombed them. Isn't that wonderful? And then we've got the Wobblies and the story of the Bread and Roses strike, and people like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the rebel girl, going all around the country organizing mainly immigrant women. The Wobblies organized the unorganized and the ones who were treated the worst. The Wobblies organized farm workers in this valley in 1910, 1911, had the big free speech fight downtown. Talk to me about it someday. Big, huge free speech fight of the IWW. There's the Bread and Roses strike. This is in Massachusetts. The women who are on strike, they all have their children. They don't have any money to take care of their children. People who are in solidarity with them in New York say, we'll take care of your children for the duration of the strike. They go down to the train station with their kids to put them on the train and send them to these folks to take care of them. The police show up and beat the hell out of all of them. It becomes one of the most famous moments of that strike. The Bread and Roses strike. We want bread, but we want roses too. All right, we're getting close to time, folks. Oh, my goodness. And I told you we wouldn't get that terribly far, right? I did tell you that, right? I didn't tell you we're going to get to the 1990s. But here, let me do something here. Let me do this. The 1930s. In the 1930s, what we see is a shift, a real change in the way labor, in labor's prospects. In the 1930s, we see people all over the country, in rural territories and cities, rise up out of kind of a desperation. But also, frankly, there was a political side to this. The Congress passed a law saying you can't have yellow dog contracts anymore. Congress passed a law saying you can't have these Debs-like injunctions anymore. You can't do these kinds of injunctions, except on very rare, unusual cases. You can't do these kinds of injunctions anymore. So there were some tools that were given by the law, but then workers went and ran with it. Now, here in California, we had the 1933 cotton strike. Talk about something, to go back to the very beginning, talk about something that is vetoed from history. We had an event here on Tuesday, and the woman who was in charge of a great event, she said, well, as I was writing this book, I learned about something that happened here in Visalia and Tulare. She's from Tulare, and she goes, I've been living here my whole life. I've never heard of the 1933 cotton strike. It's the biggest agricultural strike in American history. Tens of thousands of mainly Mexican and Filipino workers go out on strike because they are getting paid 60 cents for every 100 pounds of cotton they pick, and they want $1 for every 100 pounds. This is fought through October of 1933. Several children die of starvation during the strike down in Corcoran. A couple adults die of starvation during the strike. 4 people are killed, shot down in the middle of the street in Pixley and in Arvin. The consulate, the Mexican consulate official, is smashed in the head with the butt of a rifle. He falls to the ground. The guy turns the rifle around, just shoots him in the middle of the street, and murders him. Both sides were arrested on that one. You know, the 1933 cotton strike. But it shows the kind of militance of the moment. They didn't win, as you can imagine. And agricultural workers were excluded from most of our labor law in this country. Kind of, I would say, almost as a result. They didn't win this strike. Oh my goodness. Paul, why did you do, I told you I had 170 of these things. There we go, Cotton Strike, 1930. Look, disarm the rich farmer, arm the worker for self-defense. There's Caroline Decker. She was the organizer of it. She was 21. She was already a veteran in this stuff. She had been to Elizabethtown. She'd been to the textile mills in the South, and she'd been up in New York and so on. Caroline Decker and Pat Chambers. These aren't their real names, by the way. They're commies. So they were. They spent the most of the rest of the decade in prison for violating the California Criminal Syndicalism Act. That is, hey, I think you should get 10 cents an hour when the boss is paying 5. That's a crime. All right, so now I'm just showing you pictures, right? Southern Tenant Farmers Union, we talked about that last year. 1934 strike wave, the Toledo, the spark plugs. This guy's got good swing, don't you think? He's, nice follow through. No, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. These people are fighting. This is the Minneapolis General Strike, organizing the Teamsters. This is the 1934 General Strike here in San Francisco, taking the West Coast docks and finally having working class power on the West Coast. Who produces the wealth? Who moves all the goods? We do. You're going to do it under our conditions, or you're not going to have them moved. And think about that, shutting down the entire West Coast. Remember what happened last year, the East Coast, the ILA? It's pretty impressive, and everybody was going nuts. It's because that's how much power workers have. You can see it right there. Now, I know we're at time, and you're probably thinking, it's time to go. And all this is just a whole bunch of people being killed. And but here's the thing. I want to tell you about something that I think is kind of interesting. Millions of people went out on strike in 1933 and 1934. Millions did. And huge numbers of those folks won those strikes. They won. And they were able to establish real serious union institutions that had political power. And they rewarded Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt he didn't come into office saying, I'm going to do this. He came into office, saw that happening, and like a good politician, got out in front of it and said, I'm your leader, follow me. Right? The National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, set up the National Labor Relations Board. We now have elections. Now, okay, I shouldn't say we now have elections. There's all kinds of problems. Let's just stick to the nice stuff. You can vote for a union. It's a beautiful thing. Democracy. Remember, huge numbers of people in this country couldn't vote for their government, but by the 1930s, you could vote for a union, and that shaped under what conditions you're going to sweat it out 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for the rest of your life. Right? And when you're too old to work and too young to die, you got a little something at the end of it. It's just a beautiful thing. This act meant you don't have to go out and fight the cops and the National Guard to go do this anymore. We can have a democracy in our workplace. If 51% say yes, then we got it. Then they have to negotiate with us because it's against the law for them not to now. Now, I like to think of myself as a real radical and all this kind of stuff, and it's all about solidarity, but it's also about the law. The law is sometimes useful, folks, and we learned it 13 years later when we passed Taft-Hartley, which took away half of what the Wagner Act gained. Number one thing the Taft-Hartley Act 12 years later took away was the right to sympathy strike, the right to do what ARU did and Eugene Debs did. I can't go out on strike in sympathy with let's say, the custodians here. Not allowed to. It's against the law for me to do that. It's insane. There's Roosevelt. That's how he was rewarded. Right? Most popular person ever elected in this country. Why? I would argue it's because the working class delivered him this. And he, in a way, gave back. And then I just wanted to show you that picture of John L. Lewis, the coolest guy in the world, setting up the CIO. We got to just leave a lot of stuff on the cutting room table, don't we, Paul? Yeah, because we're done. I'm going to end on the bad note here. Not the sit-down strikes, not this one, not this one, oh my goodness, I almost got it done. This one. Well, next year we'll do part 2 starting in 1950. And we'll skip the whole first hour of all the class crap. We'll just get right into it. Take a look at the numbers of workers who are in unions at the start of the Great Depression, and then look at them by the end of World War II. And then, crackdown, crackdown, crackdown. It's been class war one way for 50 years. So we got work to do. We're worse off than they were in the 20s. All right, that's only 9 minutes late. So there we go. Now I'm done. I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Next year, we'll either do part 2, or we'll do local labor history specifically for our region so we can really dive in. Maybe we'll poll the folks in this room. How many folks learned something new here tonight? Oh, yeah. How many folks want to come back to something like this year sometime? Okay, first of all, I want you to take food if you're welcome. I want to leave you with something that Paul said that is absolutely the truth. No victory is permanent. We are all fighting right now. We've had the most amount of strikes that we've had, and strikes are winning up and down the country. We're doing an amazing job as workers, but we're still at that number. We want new people to organize, we want new people to be active in their communities, and we frankly need to defend all of our brothers and sisters who are not in unions, in different social movements, and having different injustices put upon them. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much. Have a great night. Eat the food. Get home safe.